Let's start our conversation on thinking critically with psychological science, chapter 1. Okay, psychology is a science. It employs an empirical approach. It attempts to explore and understand without misleading or being misled. It requires a scientific attitude of curiosity, skepticism, and humility. So, how does the scientific attitude support scientific inquiry? How does it support our thinking in everyday life? So, let's talk a little bit about it first. So, we have this idea of curiosity, skepticism, and humility. It prepares us to think harder and smarter. One of the key driving forces behind science is the idea that we don't want to mislead ourselves or mislead others. We are searching ultimately for the truth. So, why is psychology a science? Well, it employs an empirical approach. It looks at evidence and data. So, underlying all of this science is this passion to explore, to try to find the truth. The empirical approach is an evidence-based method that draws on observation and experimentation. We'll talk more about experimentation a little bit later. So what is this idea of curiosity? Curiosity is when we want to know something. We're curious as to why your friend keeps doing the same things over and over again, but expecting different results. Why is it that they can't seem to get past themselves at times? So we're curious as to why these things happen in our life. Skepticism, when somebody tells us something, we don't necessarily accept it with blind faith. We are skeptical. We want to know where they got that information. What is it based on? Who told you this? So we ask ourselves to be skeptical. So we're curious and we're skeptical. And then we have humility. Humility is a very key one. Humility is this idea that we understand that we can be wrong, that we don't always have the right answer, that some sort of theory or design for a study that we propose does not work out as we intended it to. So a scientific attitude requires us to be curious, to be skeptical, and to have humility because we're not always right. So that's how the scientific attitude supports scientific inquiry and how it supports us also in our everyday life. So part of that involves critical thinking. And one of the things that we want to hopefully have by the time you get out of this course is that you are better thinkers, better critical thinkers of information, better connoisseurs of information and data provided to you. So how do we do this? We want to examine the assumptions that are made. If we have poor assumptions at the very beginning, we're going to have poor results. So we want to make sure that the assumptions that we hold are indeed very accurate ones to have. We want to appraise the source of information. If I asked you where you got some information that you're telling me about, and you tell me your 7-year-old niece told you, that's one thing. But if you said your cousin who's a professor at MIT told you, that's a whole other thing. So your source really does matter. We also want to look to try to find out if there are hidden biases. When somebody presents us or try to persuade us for some reason, we want to know if there are reasons behind them trying to convince us. Do they have some hidden bias, some ulterior motive, some hidden agenda, so to speak? So if we know that they're going to get a kickback for some sort of promotion that they're trying to get people to join a particular club, then we know that maybe they're sweet talking about this particular club or association is more aligned with them getting a kickback, getting some money for people who join it, as opposed to what they truly believe. We also want to evaluate the evidence to make sure the evidence is solid evidence that they're presenting to us. That's something that we don't have other explanations as to why the evidence appears to be the way it is. And we want to assess the conclusions. Does this evidence support the conclusion that we're making here? Or are you misleading us in somehow, or misleading yourself? So being a critical consumer of information, being a critical thinker is key to the whole idea of being scientific. as part of why psychology is a science. So, thinking critically about the scientific attitude. So, we have curiosity, where we ask, does it work? When put to the test, can its predictions be confirmed? Okay, for example, can you read somebody's mind? Okay, are stress levels related to health and well-being and so on? So we can put these things to a test because we're curious about them, and we can find out whether or not there's support for them or not. Then we're also skepticism. What do you mean? How do you know? Sifting reality from fantasy requires a healthy skepticism, an attitude that is not cynical, doubting everything, but also is not gullible, believing everything. So skepticism is sort of like a great little medium. It's not doubting everything, but it's not believing everything either. We are in the middle road. We are skeptical, and that's a good place to be. Then we have humility. That was unexpected. Let's explore further. Again, you may have some idea about the research that you're doing, what you have proposed, but the data says you're wrong. It's not correct. But what that does for you, it opens up other possibilities to explore. Because again, remember, you are a person who is curious. Therefore, when the results turn out the opposite of what you expect, that makes you curious. You're more curious now as to why that happened, and you want to find out what the reason behind it actually is. That's why these are wonderful things to be part of the scientific attitude. Now, let's look at psychology being born. Now, psychology is a relatively young academic discipline. It was founded only in the 19th century, 1879, when we opened up the first psychological laboratory by Wilhelm Wundt. Okay, and why do we say 1879? There are other possibilities we could have selected as the start of psychology, but we chose the start of psychology as a discipline because of this. It was the first time that a university put aside rooms, resources for the exclusive study of research and study into psychology. So that was a big deal. So it was the first time the institution sort of supports it in that way. Therefore, it is seen as the start of psychology as an academic discipline. Wundt was studying and looking to study the measures and atoms of the mind. So he was looking at many studies. Now, the thing about it is, so we have Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, Germany, at this university. And he's the guy you go to if you really want to study psychology, or you've been interested in psychology for some time. You see they flock to him. And so some of the great names in psychology's early beginnings all go to Wilhelm Wundt to study under him. Okay, and so all these great names would then go back to their places of origin and continue his version or their version of psychology. One of his students, Erich Titchener, he is sort of associated with the first formal school of thought in psychology. There is some debate about this, but for now, let's just go with it. So structuralism is what he proposes. He was interested in the structure of the mind, and he believed by using this technique called introspection, where people were highly trained to report what they were experiencing as they sensed items and stimuli in the environment, that by collecting this data, he would be able to reveal the structures of the mind. Structuralism. Now, structuralism gave way to other schools of thought. Structuralism didn't last as long as it could have, probably, because one of the things about structuralism, it did not look to try to aid humanity in any way. Structuralism was solely about trying to find the structure of the mind, not by trying to use psychology for any particular type of purpose. Now, William James, another one of the early psychologists, he was the American entrant, he had a different take on psychology. For him, he was greatly influenced by Charles Darwin of evolution fame. And basically what William James was interested in is, what can psychology do for us? How does psychology function to aid us in our survival as a species. That was his interest was in. So very evolutionary minded. So survival, how does it aid us in survival? And so functionalism was key to us then. Psychology was being used as a means to aid us in survival. So that was their focus of those schools of thought of functionalists. And functionalism would morph into other schools of thought and other versions of psychology a little bit later. So it had a little bit more legs in many ways than structuralism did. Now, the other thing one could say about psychology in the early days, it was very homogeneous, meaning that it was not very diverse at all. All the individuals, for the most part, were males, and all, for the most part, were white males. So it was not a diverse situation. We had a few times where diversity would show up. For example, the early females involved in psychology in its early days, like Whitney Calkins and Floyd Washburn. Whitney Calkins was a pioneering memory researcher and became the first female APA president, even though she was not allowed to get her PhD when she first was able to do all the work her male counterparts did, but the school just did not offer degrees to women at the time. It was Floyd Washburn who was the first woman to actually receive a PhD for the work that she actually did. So the idea here, times had to catch up so that it would allow psychology to become more diverse by allowing women to be part of the doctoral world. So today, psychological sciences do embrace diversity much more. And how do we know this? We know this because of what is the way it is now. Now, I, as a psychologist, when I was in the field early working in the world, I realized this early on that a lot of my superiors were female. So the notion is that there was a shift. Okay, and obviously the shift may be to some degree as women got more into the work field and became more plentiful in those particular areas. They started to become more plentiful in areas that they gravitated toward. And a lot of them gravitate toward what some refer to as the nurturing careers or the nurturing fields, of which psychology is seen as one. So psychology is increasing diversity. At the 1964 meeting of the Society of Experimental Psychologists, we can see Eleanor Gibson was easiest to spot among the many male members, all in a sea of white faces. And then by contrast, we see in the other picture at the bottom here, women are now 61% of the APS members, including 75% of its psychology student affiliates. As is clear in this current photo of the APS graduate students, people of color have made enormous contributions to the field. So, as the field became more diverse, the interest in the types of things that were being studied became diverse as well. We see with the Clarks. The Clarks are famous black couple psychologists who did the famous research on black doll, white doll. Some of you may be familiar with. And this study was utilized quite a bit as part of the rationale for ending segregation in the school systems in this country. So psychology has its place, but also can have an impact on society at large. That's one of the instances where it did have a great deal of impact there. So the other thing we want to do as we want to wrap things up here is talk about psychology maturing. Now, what it comes down to is psychology matures. So we have ourselves an academic discipline now. We have these schools of thought that start to become more mature. And one of those schools of thought was a major force from the 1920s to the 1960s, and that was behaviorism. Behaviorism started by the Russian behaviorists who were able to uncover somewhat accidentally this way to look at behavior and how it influenced and was influenced by things which were quite objective, things that you could quantify and things that you could measure. Well, that was a major boon to psychology because, as I may have mentioned before, if not, I'll mention it now, psychology always sort of suffered early on from a sort of an inferiority complex with the other sciences. The idea here is that we see chemistry and biology and physics. These are the hardcore sciences, and sometimes psychology referred to as a soft science, okay? Because a lot of the things that we worked with, we could not see. They were not easily observable. But when it comes to behaviorism, one of the reasons that behaviorism really struck a chord with particularly those of us in America, was because it objectified science of psychology. We saw things now that could be objectively measured and quantified. It put us sort of on an equal footing with the other sciences out there. Okay? Therefore, behaviorists were totally anti anything dealing with introspection. Okay, introspection in psychology now viewed as a scientific study. So we didn't want to look at introspection by way of looking back about what someone is perceiving or sensing. They could really look at things scientifically, look at behavior. It can be defined, it can be conditioned, it can be observed, and it can be measured. That was the key thing that sort of put psychology on an equal footing with the other hardcore sciences, that now we have objective things that we can measure. John Watson, and his grad student, Rosalind Rayner, championed the scientific study of behavior. And what we'll talk about next time is with the Watson and Rayner study, when they said fear can be learned, and what they did to a little infant whose code name was Little Albert. We'll pick up on that when we get back into class later. Thank you.